Welcome back to the 2022 Ingenium Professional Development Seminars. On behalf of Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, I am Siwin, member of the Ingenium Task Group, and I will be the moderator for this session. We are lucky to be joined by not one, but three presenters for this session. And as their topic is so interesting, we'd like to leave time for a good question and answer section at the end. This session will be 90 minutes instead of the original advertised 60 minutes. Throughout today's presentations, we encourage you to send in any question you may have for the presenters via the chat box. Please note this presentation is being recorded and will be available through the Ingenium Hub from tomorrow until January. It is now my great pleasure to welcome our presenters for this session, Ryan Melson, who is joining us from Engineers Canada, and Gayle Frank and Danilo Caron, who is joining us from Urban System. Ryan, it's over to you.
Hello, everyone. Today, my friends Gayle Frank and Danilo Caron and I are going to be chatting about Engineers Canada's forthcoming guideline on Indigenous consultation and engagement, sharing a little bit about the process that led to the creation of this guideline, the unique process that its development took, and then potential future steps for this guideline and what it could mean for the profession in Canada. First, I'd like to start off with some introductions. So hello, my name, as I said, is Ryan Melson. I grew up in Kamloops Te Shikwapam, also known as Kamloops in English. And I'm currently living in Omama Winninewag, Anishinaabe Algonquin territory in Ottawa. My position is the CEQB Secretary, that's the Canadian Engineering Qualifications Board Secretary, and Manager of Qualifications at Engineers Canada.
Waitap Gayle Frank and Squest, Hoishin Statliman Steckman. My name is Gayle Frank, and I'm from the Smiling People of Bridge River, which is by Lillooet, BC. I currently reside in the Tecumseh territory. I work at Urban Systems out of the Kamloops office. I've been a part of Urban Systems for about 4 years. I work as an Indigenous community consultant, and I mainly do Indigenous engagement as well as a practice development around truth and reconciliation. Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Ani bonjour, Danilo Nindishnakas, Wabazeshin and Dodom, Kamloops Nindinjaba, Sagama Kanishnabek First Nation Dimandagos, Vancouver Ninjagodaya. Hello, my name is Danilo Caron. I'm a member of the Martin Clan. I'm from Kamloops originally, like Ryan, and also currently live in Vancouver. I'm a member of the Sagama Kanishnabek First Nation. Visiting right now on my home territory, just west of Sudbury. I am engineering training with Urban Systems and a PhD student at University of British Columbia. Thank you very much.
Okay, so to kick off, just wanted to share a little bit of information about what Engineers Canada is, what it represents, and why it had decided to undertake this work. So Engineers Canada is really an association of Canada's 12 engineering regulators, Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba being one of them. The regulators represent the engineers of Canada, 300,000 members of the engineering profession in Canada. But what Engineers Canada is a grouping, and it allows the various regulators to come together, have national conversations, think about issues at a national level, and Engineers Canada provides a wide variety of support under this mandate of bringing together the regulators and putting them into conversation. So it's worth mentioning, Engineers Canada's vision is advancing Canadian engineering through national collaboration. And so all of the scope of the work that we do really tries to have buy-in and consult at the provincial and territorial level, and ensure that in whatever ways are possible, we are collaborating. It doesn't always mean reaching consensus, but it does mean trying to work together and continuing to come to the table and join into these conversations, thinking about the benefit of the profession, and definitely issues in the profession and things that need to be improved and things that need to be worked on. So within that context, then, Engineers Canada has a group called the Indigenous Advisory Committee. So the Indigenous Advisory Committee is made up of Indigenous engineers, and its core purpose is to improve several areas. So one is to do with Indigenous access to engineering, so advising on outreach programs, strategy around Indigenous access to engineering, improving the representation. It is very low. It's under 1% for Indigenous engineers in Canada. So there's much needed improvement. And then the second part of the Indigenous Advisory Committee's advising has to do with engineering practice in Canada. And that's where the guideline that we're going to be talking about today really comes in. So certainly one of the, every code of ethics across the country for engineers refers to the obligation to safeguard the public. And certainly when we are talking about the relationship between the engineering profession and Indigenous communities, this has been a very patchy and in some cases harmful relationship. So the public has not been safeguarded. And so the Indigenous Advisory Committee very correctly recommended that Engineers Canada undertake work with a national scope to improve practices around consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities to really ensure that safeguarding is a critical part that's at the forefront of engineering projects that are and development projects that are happening in those communities. So given that mandate, it was assigned to the group that I manage at Engineers Canada, which is called the Canadian Engineering Qualifications Board. The Qualifications Board provides recommendations and guidelines on getting qualified to license as an engineer in Canada, and then also engineering practice. It's quite a gamut of projects that we end up working on kind of across the board. So we're supporting, at that national level. This work was assigned in December 2019, and we kicked it off December 2020, and then we kicked it off early in 2021, put out a request for proposals, urban systems. My dear colleagues were among the proposals that came in and felt that they were an excellent fit and had a lot of expertise that they could bring and knowledge that they could bring to this project and this topic. And so through that process, they were selected, and since then we have begun working together. Before jumping into kind of the specifics of the guideline, we want to talk about the process, because the process really became an important part of developing this guideline. So as you can see on the screen, there's a standard consultation process that Engineers Canada has recommended that we use in the development of the guideline. And it's this lovely wheel. Its purpose is really to ensure that we're getting buy-in at key moments of a project's development, so that the people who are approving the project later on will actually approve it. So it's to make sure that there's a line of sight and visibility throughout the project. But it's a very standard process, and it follows a pretty set timeline, and we definitely it becomes a kind of well-oiled machine over time. But as we're talking about a guideline on consultation and on engagement, we definitely considered that we would need to be sensitive to the fact that the needs of this project may be different throughout. And so when we were working on this, at every step on this wheel, we've really been thinking about what are the unique needs, how can we make this project meaningful, how can it be an inclusive project that truly has some the elements of good relationships with the people who would either benefit or not benefit from its creation. So with that, I will hand it to Gayle. Do you want to start here, Gayle, or?
Actually, Ryan, I think it's me. The next slide would be probably good. As Ryan was just describing, this process that Engineers Canada undergoes for all of its guidelines has multiple steps. But what's interesting is the engagement part, where we wanted to interact with guideline users and stakeholders. actually only occurs between step 1 and 2. So we've included this diagram to kind of show you our thought process that guided us in making it from the environmental scan to the general direction document, which Ryan will discuss later. We wanted to bring, we recognized that developing this guideline had to look different at all stages. And we also wanted to role model some of the principles that we knew were going to eventually be in the guideline itself. So with Engineers Canada as our client, and also I would also view our relationship as co-learning, because as we felt our way through this process, we had to adapt. And to Engineers Canada's credit, they were very receptive to our suggestions. And these sub-steps within the environmental scan are kind of articulate that. We worked with everyone involved about preparing to do this work. And some of that was going back to foundational documents, the Truth and Reconciliation, the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls to Action, even going back to RCAP, Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. These were foundational things, and they motivate the process. So we had to step back and actually be informed by that. So that also, that would also be the pre-engagement learning that we kind of underwent. And then we also started to apply principles that Urban Systems has learned over the years about respectful engagement and consultation. And then, of course, through dialogue with Engineers Canada, we came up with our engagement plan. And we actually deviated from the original RFP that had one engagement session. And through our conversations, we recognized that that wasn't going to be enough. We needed to be inclusive regionally, culturally, and provide opportunities for people who couldn't just make one single date. So these are all some of the factors that went into bringing more process that typically doesn't happen for a guideline. And then throughout that, we tried to inform the process with Indigenous perspectives. Gayle and I are from different communities, so we brought different understandings. And we also recognize that there's so much cultural diversity within Canada. We also try to reflect that in our process. And I'll leave it at that. But this particular 4-step process took up a lot of time and energy, and it was really important to get it right. Like Ryan was saying, we recognize that this guideline had to look different even in its process.
It was really important at the very beginning of the project to identify that incorporating Indigenous lens to the project was really important as a grounding piece for ensuring that the information and knowledge that we were going to be gathering was going to be gathered in a respectful way. And it was also really important to be able to establish that the relationship building piece was integral to building this guideline. And some of the Indigenous protocols that we incorporated included asking an elder to be part of the process. And we were very grateful that we were able to have Elder Norman. And Elder Norman is Métis, he's from Manitoba, but he was a part of every single engagement session for the regional gatherings as well as the national gatherings. And I think having that consistency throughout the process was really grounding. And there was different protocols that we ended up incorporating when asking Elder Norman to be a part of our process. So there was tobacco offerings between our team and Elder Norman at the very beginning of every single session, just to ensure that we're asking him in a respectful way to be a part of our process. And he provided a lot of insights, and he created a really safe space for the participants to be able to share their thoughts and their feelings. And we also decided to use a different kind of engagement style for the for the regional gatherings and for the national gatherings. So we incorporated a talking circle style, and having a talking circle ensures that every single participant that's in the circle has the opportunity to listen and learn, as well as to feel safe enough to share their thoughts and their knowledge. And because this was held in a virtual space in the middle of the pandemic, we had to really adjust it. So we thought about how we could host a circle virtually, because normally we would be sitting in chairs in a circle and having a talking piece. So we incorporated a virtual tool called the Wheel of Names. And it was like this fun little activity that we would put up on the screen. Everybody's name that was in the circle was on the screen. And then we'd click it, it would like spin around, and then it would land on somebody, and it would just pop up saying, like, you know, Ryan's speaking next, and then the floor would be for Ryan. And we also utilized a mural board. So we had our presentation and our questions up on mural. So we were sharing screens between the Wheel of Names and the mural board, where it had like a list of questions, and whoever was speaking or whose turn it was to speak had the floor. And everybody was on mute. They were present with the cameras on, but they listened intently. And it was shared at the beginning of some sessions and at the end of some sessions that they weren't really, participants weren't really expecting to participate in this process. They thought they were coming in to attend as more of a listening participant and to learn. And the great thing about this process was that they were able to do those things, but they felt safe enough in order to share. And at the end of the talking circle, so we would go through a round of questions for about 45 minutes. Everybody had a chance to speak. And then we would give like a little bit of free time on the mural board, and people would be able to write sticky notes and write their thoughts that they had just shared verbally, but write their thoughts physically and place it onto the mural board. And it ended up being like a really well-rounded process, because people were able to really establish their thoughts before they actually had to like write them down. And one of the great things about hosting our engagement sessions this way is that it held space. It held space for the Indigenous process, for the Indigenous lens. And we had a very diverse group of participants. We'll get into that a little bit later, but we were making sure that we were very respectful for Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, as well as like non-registered Indigenous peoples. And yeah, it ended up being a really well-rounded process that happened over, I think, 3 months.
Can I just add a comment there, Gayle, too? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say and mentioned about people's feedback, that they were expecting to sit, listen, maybe get some knowledge, and maybe, you know, raise a question or two or something like that. It was a very active process, and I think that, you know, it again comes back to this sort of standard process that Engineers Canada has used. So our workshops, typically what you'll get is like an info dump from somebody, right? A whole bunch of information or knowledge, build some group knowledge, and then have maybe some brief, you know, breakout sessions. But for me, you know, the talking circle format, there's a lot of learning from going through that format, because we often have the issue where big voices will sort of take over the room. And I mean, there's just a lot of passion there, and it's not, you know, critical of those voices, but it's important to have, you know, space created for a variety of communication styles, you know, and different ways that people want to talk. So it was great that they got to type things out and use stickies and do something kind of more tactile and visual. And then like, yeah, the holding space and just really allow, like, having this structure that, you know, intentionally makes everybody pause and listen instead of waiting to jump in with their point, which I just did. No, but I really, yeah, that there was good learning. And I think that, you know, what we've discovered is like just that we can apply this learning to, you know, a variety of other, you know, work that we do, you know, going forward.
Danilo, did you have any thoughts?
On the previous slide or this one? I would just echo the notion of also being like the holding space. There's so much within that one bullet. Really, like making sure that, like Ryan noted, that not everyone wants to participate verbally in front of a group, even though there were small intimate sessions. So some people did a lot of their contributing through the mural board. And I can touch on that later when it comes to the kind of the analysis of our data.
Can't remember if I was supposed to chat about this slide, but you can see here the process that we did and how we kind of broke things down. So we had three regional gatherings, and you'll see on the next slide the breakdown for those. We had majority Indigenous participants in those 3 sessions, which was really pretty wonderful that we were able to accomplish that. And then so from there we had 2 national gatherings. One was at the qualifications board meeting, which is a virtual meeting, and the second was there was a feeling that we needed to dig more deeply into the issues. So the groups involved with that, I think Danilo, you had a list of all the groups that were involved, but the qualifications board, regulators, some of our participants from the regional gatherings, but it shifted. And I think, it was a good point to shift and get introduce some new perspectives, because we'd already built a good amount of knowledge that informed those 2 gatherings. And then could have some of these other groups that work kind of at the national level.
And it was also really important for us to ensure that when we were hosting these regional gatherings, that we were cognizant of the diversity of Indigenous peoples across Canada. So we kind of grouped Indigenous groups based on their regions. And so we would have like the Western gathering was more for like BC and Alberta, and I think North. And just being really mindful and respectful that Indigenous groups do have a very diverse culture, languages, and so it was a little bit easier for us to navigate this. Originally, we were going to have an elder from each of the regions attend. I think it worked out a lot better having Elder Norman be consistent through every single regional and national gathering that we hosted. And so we were doing mainly like knowledge and information gathering at the regional gatherings. And then the national gatherings, we were doing more of like reporting back, but also still gathering, but not the same information. So we weren't like redoing the same things at the national gathering. And it ended up working out really well. It was a really good, smooth process. So yeah.
And just one other, oh, sorry, go ahead, Danilo.
Oh, what I was going to add was, I think one of like, Gayle, you mentioned the difference between the regional gatherings and the national gathering. And part of it was kind of the expertise we brought into the regional gatherings, and really just focusing on listening, sharing and kind of reflecting on all that information without getting too, like, it was really natural to get drawn into like, what's the guideline going to contain? What's it going to contain? What's going to contain? We had to really hold ourselves back to say, like, let's just listen, right? Let's pose some questions, let's discuss. Let's just kind of really be present in these small spaces, and build trust, right? And these are things that kind of echo throughout all of the stages. And then when we went to the national gathering, as Ryan was describing, like the different, the qualifications board, the practice committee, members from representatives of the Indigenous Engagement Committee, and also the regional, the provincial and territorial regulators. So we had a very different group. And one thing we got a lot of positive feedback on was a 3-person panel that we held at one of the national gatherings. And that was, we had three Indigenous people, a water operator, an engineer, and also Elder Norman Mead. And where they did presentations and they fielded some questions. And it was an opportunity for the qualifications board and for the practice committee to kind of feel almost like a bit of a summary, but gather firsthand perspectives from kind of what we heard at the regional gatherings. So we tried not to duplicate the regional gatherings, but we had to bring some of that forward. And then we thought that by having a panel, it was a very accessible way of doing that, and some of the personal stories shared were very powerful. And I know that we received quite a few follow-up feedback from people who thanked us for just collecting this expertise and understanding for them to experience. And I think that was valuable for most people.
Yeah, and one question that we encountered early on in the project and throughout the project is, how do you actually account for the diversity of communities? There are hugely different groups with different backgrounds, different traditions, different relationships with the land around them. There's so many factors in diversity, and then even within each of those communities, a huge amount of diversity. So there was certainly an acknowledgement that we could not adequately capture that. And so, it was, I think as we were developing this and having these conversations, one of the things that I was keeping in mind is, how can this be open enough that other people can encounter it, who we unfortunately were not able to include in the process, and be interested in it and take it and start to build relationships with, people who went beyond, the group that we were able to consult as we were working on the project. Yeah.
So we did have quite a diverse group for each of the regional gatherings and the national gatherings, and we were pleasantly surprised that we had a majority of Indigenous participants, and for every single gathering. The gatherings were small, but I think that created the safe space. It was grounded culturally. It was grounded, I think there was, yeah, I had said before, it was grounded with Elder Norman. And I think having the perspectives of both the non-Indigenous and Indigenous participants sharing their knowledge and having that space to be able to listen and learn to each other provided a solid foundation for moving through the questions. So we had representations from First Nations, and this was really powerful feedback, especially when it came to answering questions around consultation and engagement and what works really well. There was a lot of storytelling themes that really grounded the learnings that were shared. And I think we've included some of those knowledge bits as little snippets within the guideline, and I think that's really important to honor as well. But yeah, we had Métis and Inuit participation as well, and I just think it's created a very solid foundation. And I keep saying that, but it's true. So when participants were moving through the questions and being able to answer them and have that free space to be able to answer the questions, and knowing that there was non-Indigenous engineers and participants listening, I think that really built the relationships, and it's an important aspect of the guideline.
If I could add a comment there too, one thing that I observed was, so in preparation for this guideline and just by virtue of the work that I'm undertake, I've read plenty about, Indigenous knowledge and what that means and why it's important, but to actually hear, a person from Indigenous community talk about how, an engineer came in and was going to do I think it was a micro hydro dam or hydro dam project, and said, oh no, this is the model you need, this is the one, and really not listen, and the elders are like, well, you better be careful because there's sediment that builds up, there, and it could cause problems for that kind of like generation. And they went back and forth. The engineers like, nope, I'm the expert here, and really, failed to listen. And of course, this project ended up costing millions of dollars down the road because, as the people who knew that river very well had suggested, the sediment built up, and the dam failed to work as it intended, and ended up. So you can really see there, a case where, just to come back to what I started with, the idea of safeguarding the public. Well, safeguarding also means, economic, and there's a place where an engineer really failed to safeguard economically a project because they didn't properly consult and get the proper data points, which were the people who knew that place very well. So yeah.
I'd like to speak to a little bit about the people that we had in the engagement sessions. And we talked a lot about this. We spent a lot of time about just discussing not like the facilitation style we wanted, and how that would dictate, who we brought into those spaces. And during the regional gatherings, we wanted to bring in experienced perspectives, whether they were community members, asset managers, engineers, project managers, all these different types of people who have this expertise. And we wanted to, like I said earlier, model engagement principles that we knew were very important. And part of that is building rapport, building trust, relationships. So we tried to spend the time at all the gatherings, providing space for that. And so one thing that we kind of decided we needed to avoid was essentially a blanket invite to a session where we would have, maybe 75, 125 people, not really being able to engage in a human way. And also, likely being kind of screens off, just being one of these info sessions we've all sat in and kind of partially participated in, so what we wanted to do is have like a really rich, deep engagement so quality over quantity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that is something that we struggled with because as we got into the engagement, even though we distributed to what I thought was a large group of people and having engagement sessions in the summer via Zoom, and they were long. Yes, they were 4 hours long. So that I know drew from potential participants, but it was also, we felt that we wanted those people in the space for long enough that we could meet them, listen from them, learn from them. So these are kind of some of the strategies we used, and some of the reasons why we didn't go with a kind of a massive campaign of like, let's get 10,000 or maybe 1,000 people involved in 5 engagement sessions or something like that, right? We really wanted to be very intentional about it. And these are things that we learned along the way. Is like, and in the next iterations, we'll probably have to revisit and say like, what is the best way of building relationships? We're going to be hopefully out of a COVID situation. And so it'll look different again. But I just wanted to give you some context on you're looking at a graph of the people who were there percentage wise, but not actual values. And I just want to give you a sense of why we chose the method of intimate presentations and talking circles over what we're probably really used to, which is kind of large Zoom sessions with experts talking at you. Now, out of these engagement sessions, in particular the regional gatherings, we collected a lot of information. For those who couldn't make an engagement session, we also had a survey that was on the project website. So we gathered survey questions and answers, and between the 3 different regional gatherings. Now, of course, we provided opportunities for people who couldn't make their region so that they could attend a different one. So we had some people attending cross ones, and that was not really the purpose of keeping people compartmentalized. It was mostly partly due to time zones, to keep it convenient for people. But we collected a lot of information through the oral storytelling, through people engaging, telling their history and their experiences. Also, people sharing through the mural board. As I said, we also had the survey responses. So we collected this massive data, and now I'll put on my researcher hat, and I was the one who basically processed all this information. And these 6 themes: motivation, patience, community focus, respect, striving for balance, and then creating this practical guideline and the important transparency along with it. These are the things that filtered out. And I'm not doing it justice, because it spent a lot of time very intentionally trying to remove any biases I was bringing to the process, because I definitely brought with me kind of ideas of what respectful engagement looks like, principles of building trust. But I really did try to be objective and follow the text segments, the notes that were taken by all of our facilitators in the small spaces, to try and synthesize what were the key things. And at this point here, as I was mentioning earlier, these have nothing really to do with tangible guideline outputs. What we wanted to find out, what did we hear? What are the key themes that emerged from all these discussions? And these are the ones that came out. And now these we brought forward to the national gathering, and we shared in different ways. Like, we can also added through the panel, but we also kind of, the next series of talking circles at the national gathering were informed by these 6 themes. And then as we move forward in the process that Ryan will describe, these come along for the ride. Even though these themes were kind of based on the engagement, when I look at the draft guideline in its current state, I can see these 6 themes throughout it. They find themselves in different places, but they're there. So we just wanted to spend a moment to describe, what were the key messages that we learned from those engagement sessions.
So I won't belabor this one too much, but it is worth talking just a little bit about the standard process that Engineers Canada uses when it's developing its guidelines, and then what happened differently. So we had a unique experience, I would say, certainly in my limited, a couple years in this position. Haven't seen anything quite like it happen. So just in general, a general direction document, its purpose is really to build stakeholder consensus before you do the work. So that is before you, spend the time drafting a 30 or 40 page guideline, really to ensure that it's on the right track, that you're headed in the right direction. And it usually has grown out of, typically we call them workshops, but in this case we call them gatherings, and it was quite, substantial process. I would say a much more substantial process than we undertake when we have a less diverse group that we're trying to work with. So yeah, when these actually come together, there's various approvals and things that happen, but it really is a defining moment for the project. It sets the wheels in motion, and then the project sort of unfolds and unfurls into the world from there. But one thing that often happens when we develop general direction documents is there are very intensive debates. So generally our stakeholders for Engineers Canada documents are just engineering regulators. We obviously reached out to a wider group when we were working on this guideline, and we'll continue to reach out to a larger group on the consultation on the guideline itself. But this is the place where regulators have to figure it out amongst themselves, and often really can't kind of reach any consensus, or they can be useful for elaborating points of where it's difficult to kind of reconcile perspectives. But it can also be tricky because you have to develop the guideline eventually, and you have to do the work. But that's our usual context. But the unique thing that happened with this general direction document was that there was consensus on it. Amazingly, when we sent it out for regulators, there were very few comments. Basically, most people indicating more or less, we really support this work. We want to see this moving forward. And hearing back in that way. So it was a bit of a shock because it kind of didn't change from the draft to the kind of final version of the general direction. To my mind, I'd like to think that is a reflection of the good process that we undertook to get us to the general direction. These conversations, the themes that Danilo outlined, all of the group and the people who participated early and sort of gave us their point of view and shared their experiences became easier to feel as if they had not been ignored or missed in the process. Now, so I think that that was definitely a pleasant surprise. And also, I would say, a theme personally in my role at Engineers Canada that emerged from this is learning from this unique process that we undertook when we developed this guideline. One of the terms that I am not, deeply immersed in the literature on, but the topic of indigenization, for me, there's a very practical version of that happened throughout this guideline. We learned how to listen better as a result of working on a guideline on listening better, and so I've seen, since we developed this general direction and worked on and have worked on the earlier stages of this document, that impacting, influencing, and helping us rethink our approaches across the board. So leave it at that.
So it was really important early on to establish the actual meetings for consultation and engagement. So as an engagement specialist, especially working with First Nations communities, going into a community and saying you're going to consult with them or have a consultation process, we have to be really careful around that kind of language because sometimes it indicates is a community going to be engaged at for the legal obligation with the Crown? Is that the intention of coming into the community? And a lot of the times when opponents come in and they say they want to consult, they actually just want to be able to have a discussion and do some note taking and get the views of the First Nations. But when you have the actual legal obligation to consult with the First Nations community, there's usually the expectation that there is a possibility of having to accommodate First Nations on the decisions that are actually going to be impacting that community. And so we had to make very early on within the draft guideline the the different meanings for engagement and consultation. And we found out through a lot of the storytelling that most people that are going into communities are actually there for the purpose of engagement. And the biggest part of this is for engagement is building that relationship between consultants and the First Nations community. And stories were shared about how this can happen, and quite a few of them were being present within the community, attending community events, incorporating the language within final deliverables, asking about the protocols, and respectfully learning how to engage with the Indigenous communities. And a lot of that gets down to what kind of questions do I need to be asking? How do I ask? Who do I ask? And so yeah, there was a lot of good discussion around that and a lot of knowledge sharing as well. And so yeah, engagement I think has a little bit more of a collaboration approach to final deliverables, and that's really strongly links to the Truth and Reconciliation, because within the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, there is a lot of collaboration initiatives between the action items. And so, yeah, this is just like one little snippet within the draft guideline, but we wanted to make sure early on that this distinction was there. Ryan?
Yeah. So my comment on this title for the guideline was assigned to us, assigned to the qualifications board, I should say, from the get-go. And so when you're conceiving a project and thinking about a project early on, you think about the relationship between terms and what kind of key terms need to be understood, right? And so one of the shifts from my perspective as this project proceeded was when we originally conceived it, I thought of two boxes sort of side by side, consultation, engagement. These are the two things that are going to be covered. I pictured them completely on an equal footing. Well, sort of like 50% consultation, 50% engagement. That's what the guideline would be. But what was really interesting, particularly as we encountered some, chatted with a person from one community, is she said, we don't like this term consultation, that it can serve as a tick box. It kind of like, we did our obligation, we did our duty, it's a done deal, right? And so she expressed a great preference for the idea of engagement, right? And so I think that as the project evolved, what I saw is we're going from this side-by-side 50-50 kind of relationship to consultation is this tiny part. Engagement is the context that makes it a good consultation or a bad consultation, right? And so engagement is really the critical part. It's the relationship building. It's, all the things that Gayle mentioned, going into the community, getting to know the people, making sure you have the right people, continuing to make sure you have the right people, extending the relationship beyond just the, parameters of the project and getting the tick box to get through one phase of the project. It's all that stuff. And so, that has informed that type of process informed this guideline. I think will inform its future as well. We built relationships as a critical, fundamentally important part of this guideline. The question is how do we maintain those? How do we sustain these? We consulted as part of the guideline, got people's sent up the document, got the feedback, we'll continue to send the document, get the feedback at these critical points, but it's not just about that. It's not just about using somebody to get something done, to make a project happen or something like that. It's much more, there's a lot of growth and learning around that element to this.
Ryan, I think I'll add a little bit to that too, is, as Gayle described, and what the slide shows is consultation brings this, it brings the baggage of the duty to consult. And with a lot of policy, the baggage from a community's perspective isn't necessarily good baggage, right? And so this idea of engagement and consultation kind of being embedded within an engagement process that, that involves building trust, that involves building partnerships and collaboration. And then when a project is over, the engagement continues as a form of maybe capacity building or just further community or further relationship building. So when you look at it through that lens, you're much better prepared to make the transition that UNDRIP is going to bring. We're just slowly starting to see UNDRIP impact, all structures and processes. And out here in BC, we're actually actively looking at how UNDRIP is going to affect everything from what we call the Heritage Conservation Act is probably the first one that's going to be updated with a lens on everything that UNDRIP contains. And so we're now starting to see the challenging part of passing UNDRIP legislation is how does it impact current legislation, future legislation, and then how does that legislation impact industries like geoscience and engineering? So for some of you in this space listening to us, you're going to be very interested in what is this UNDRIP thing about? How does it affect me? When are the changes coming? And if you have made the shift from a consultation mindset to an engagement mindset that's more holistic, built around building trust and relationships, then your shift to building consensus, and I say that in the sense of like the free, prior, informed consent that's contained within UNDRIP, you know, you're going to be much better prepared. And that's one thing that this guideline is hopefully going to prepare people for. And, you know, this idea of consultation versus engagement was an important thing to just get out there in the open, to say that, you know, these are not the same. If you are, if you're only concerned with consultation and, like Gayle said, like checking the box, then hopefully this guideline will prepare you for the changes coming. Now, the draft guideline in its current state is broken down into a number of sections, and we recognize the need for the guideline to be very usable, and it needs to be concise. It needs to contain what you need to know, and not much more, so that you can access what you need to easily. But we felt this real tension in trying to achieve a responsible balance between glazing over all the history, the shared history that we share, settlers and Indigenous communities, and doing that justice, because this is a guideline unlike others. You know, when it comes to technical specifications and that, there usually isn't a large cultural component to it. A lot of you know, reconciliation between reconciling relationships that have gone awry, building futures that where prosperity is built in for everyone. So we did address certain things like what we just talked about, consultation versus engagement. That's one of these things that are found in the background at the beginning of the guideline. But this is something we went back and forth with Engineers Canada and within our group at Urban Systems, is what do we contain? You know, how much is critical information? How much do we have a responsibility to put in there, so that you don't just jump to like the summary, right? So as a user, you will encounter some information that we thought was absolutely critical, foundational documents that this is built on as motivation, important principles that you absolutely need to understand. So before you even get to the actual, what we would call like the instructions for the guideline, we also created a section called individual and organizational preparation. So not all people are equipped with a background understanding of our shared history, and that's an important thing that we felt that, you know, we needed to spend time on. How does an organization or an individual professional prepare themselves for this? So not only does the guideline contain what we feel is necessary, but it also provides resources and suggested resources as well. Now, part of before you even get into contacting a nation, whatever your project is, you know, we include a section on pre-engagement learning. And this is kind of your tabletop research things, approaches to making connections within a community. Now, I should maybe take a step back, because what we heard during the engagement sessions was, yes, there's lots of diversity. There's lots of different capacities with different communities. There's different protocols. There's different histories with the consultation industry. So these are all things that we tried to contain in one guideline, which was like very hard, leaning on maybe impossible. So what we did try to do, and we actually did push back a little bit, in a sense of we got some feedback from guideline stakeholders who wanted a guideline that was more of a flow chart with steps that you needed to check off. And then we did have to say that this is not a checklist, that you have to feel your way through this. And if that's uncomfortable, that is the reality, unfortunately. So the diversity that you're going to encompass is going to be something you're going to have to work out. That's not to say that you can't prepare yourself and have a useful guide to bring you through the process. And that's what we're hoping this is. If you're looking for a 4-point process of doing pre-engagement learning, it's not going to be that, but it will guide you through considerations in which you need to consider. And when you look at your organization, you may say that, we have this, this, and this, but we need to bring in someone to teach us this, or something like that. Now, of course, the guideline itself has a number of principles of consultation engagement that basically are explained under the topics that lead into the last section, which is basically creating an engagement plan that kind of highlight those principles of respectful consultation and engagement. One thing I'd like to describe is that throughout this guideline, we included a lot of quotes from participants from the engagement sessions, because we wanted to highlight, not only their contributions, but their expertise, and in some cases, just the sheer amount of effort and energy that they put into it. And not only that, but their voice captures it better than we can. So with all of these individual organizational preparation, pre-engagement learning principles, and creating an engagement plan, you'll find actual quotes of people describing their process or their experience that highlight the principle that we're talking about. And I thought that was, as we were developing that was, as someone who was involved in the writing of it, I found that very powerful, because it actually puts, it wraps the concept with context. And I think that end users will like that.
So, a consideration, this is definitely something that we heard throughout the process of getting to where we've got. The guidelines expected to launch early to mid 2023, depending on how various approvals and things go. But there is a feeling that often when a guideline gets developed, it kind of sits on the shelf and really doesn't, it is useful for a time, and then maybe it gets refreshed down the road. So, typically Engineers Canada guidelines from the Qualifications Board are on a 6-year review cycle, and that's how we've done this work. But I think that we certainly have many questions about how to keep the insights of this document fresh, and how to maintain it as a kind of living document. So I guess I'll read these off. We had sort of brainstorming, and this would be something to pass over to the audience. I think, like, before I jump into the questions, just one comment I'd like to make. So when you think of an engineering work, for example, the hydroelectric dam that I mentioned earlier, it really does embody a group of relationships. It's an embodiment of relationships, right? And so if if there is good consultation and engagement, and really good engagement as part of the development of that project, then it can embody good relationships. Unfortunately, there are many examples from the past that embody bad relationships, where there was improper consultation, where the relationships weren't built. And then, the folks who have to use this infrastructure or this engineered work sit there and look at that as a symbol of that on an ongoing basis. So it's really, fundamental when you're thinking about what a project represents to a group of people, that it be developed, so like through good relationships, that it be developed, because it will sit and serve as sort of a testament to the good work that everybody put into it. They can sustain relationships in a funny kind of way. So we're hoping, this document can also sustain relationships in a similar way that it has been built through a good process, that where there was a real sincere effort to listen. So these are the questions we came up with. I don't know if I need to read them all off, or if maybe we'll split them up. I'll read a couple, Dale, and then Gayle and Danilo. So how do you keep it a living document when it's embedded in static or very slowly changing institutions? This, refers to the 6-year reiteration cycle or revision cycle that Engineers Canada uses. Do we want it to sit there for 6 years? Do we want to, continue to think of ways to engage with this work? Do we want to continue to, pull in new insights that we gather from talking to people, and refresh the document and keep it sort of alive in there. Likewise, how do you bring in new voices so it can continually grow? As I mentioned, one of my hopes for this project is that even though we couldn't include everybody that in its development, and we tried to at least be representative and think about really mindfully about who we were able to bring to the table, but down the road, as others encounter this, how do we ensure that their insights are becoming an important part of, the greater document, and continuing to revitalize and recharge it and improve it as, time goes on. So maybe I'll pass the next O2 over to who wants to take them? Gayle, Jill.
So yeah, some of the questions that we have still, moving forward with this after it's been published, is how do you keep the relationship strong? And just to really ensure that it isn't a document that sits on a shelf, or it's not just something somebody can say, okay, yeah, we have this, check the tick mark, and we want to be able to ensure that this guideline is something that can be used. And so I think, yeah, really trying to understand how to keep that relationship going after is really important. And we also want to be able to know how might this document be used to build trust with future readers and users of the guideline.
All right, I think you just passed it off to me. The engagement that we did for this project and this iteration of the project, how do we evolve that in a way that meets, guidelines, stakeholders, communities, organizations. So this is something that we've learned already, in many things, but we are still receiving feedback on that. So these are things that we're mindful of, that we don't have necessarily the answer right away, but as the guideline gains traction, we anticipate learning even more. And that kind of leads to this last question of how does it continue to be useful? It definitely has to reflect, changes in societal values, reconciliation being one, and political forces such as UNDRIP. From a personal perspective, I see it evolving, as so many things in society do. And, these are things that we seek input from people like yourself attending this workshop today, other stakeholders. These are not the only questions that we hope that you ask or that we can discuss now, but if you have any other questions about the guideline, its development, Engineers Canada's kind of the background on it, the way that we've compiled it, or other features of it, we welcome those questions now. I'll pass you back now to our facilitator.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your presentation on Indigenous consultation and engagement. I think this is a wonderful way to rebuild trust and respect our Indigenous community. For our audience, if you have any questions you'd like to ask Ryan, Gayle, or Danilo, please type them in the chat. Just a quick reminder that this session is extended until 3 p.m. today. Wonderful. So I can start with the first question I have from Puru. So how about the level of consultations? I'm not sure if it's so if I think, you are all, I think Brian is muted. So yeah, so if you can unmute, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, so would you like to start with the first question I have? How about level of consultation?
So yeah, I think we're waiting each other out there, Danilo. Go ahead, Danilo.
Oh, okay. I saw that in the chat and I looked it up. And I think Peru, I think what you're, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but are you asking about how many people were in the engagement sessions that we held? I'll answer that question. If it's not that, maybe let us know. But in our regional gatherings, we had 37 individuals taking part. And we also had 12 surveys returned. And we also did another survey afterwards that was kind of before the draft was released. I don't know how many of those were returned, maybe another 10. Those were kind of more specific, and they were definitely informed by the general direction document had already passed already. So we had a much clearer idea of what the guideline was going to look like already. So we did circulate a survey to get some insights on some specific things.
Yeah, I think later in the chat, Peru extended saying that does the guideline provide any details about the level of consultation?
So level of engagement and level of consultation are two very different things. So the level of engagement would be more around the relationship building. I also see that there's another question around that. The level of consultation, you have to be really prepared to bring in the lawyers, to have, to be ready to be able to accommodate any decisions that are going to be affecting the First Nations. So the level of consultation when you're doing any kind of, and it's really hard because people interchange consultation and engagement with First Nations interchangeably, and they're two very different things. So just because you're engaging a community lots, being present in the community, having lots of community engagements, does not necessarily mean that you're engaged or you're consulting with them. So they have to be a part of the decision-making processes and be able to state what it is that we need to have accommodated for any decisions that are going to be affecting them. Yeah, so one requires more attention with lawyers than it does with the leadership within the community.
Yeah, I think, thank you for your answer. I think I have a next question for you right here. So at what point does engagement from early stages become consultation required legally?
I think you need to be able to explicitly state to the client that you're moving into the consultation phase. And it needs to be brought up in a really respectful way so that it's not confused as being engaged. And then, so you can't come into the community, say you're doing community engagement, and then all of a sudden you're going back and saying, okay, we've consulted with them. That's not how it's respectfully done. But yeah, I think Brian has. No?
I was jumping actually to the next question. I thought,
okay.
I thought you'd sort of answered both those when they came up.
I might just add something quick about that, because we definitely address the duty to consult, which is a requirement on proponents when projects impact the established or asserted Aboriginal rights. So this guideline is definitely very clear that it is not used as like we're not going to consult these people because this guideline told me not to. This guideline in many ways is like a parallel layer that engineers and engineering firms can use alongside other requirements that they have to do. So some of these requirements are the duty to consult, but some of them are also regional, like provincial, territorial, and federal requirements. And that changes from
from the type of industry that you represent. So if it's oil and gas or fisheries, all sorts of different things that you may be involved in, this guideline prepares you for that notion of the duty to consult. But it stays clear of giving you the guardrails in which you absolutely have to stay within. So that's a great question. And because the duty to consult is undergoing, it has always been undergoing changes, and largely due to Supreme Court findings. The goalposts have slowly been moved in no small effort to nations fighting for sovereignty over their territories. So this is only I wish I could go on for a long time. And I just want to let you know, to answer your question, that the guideline acknowledges the duty to consult, but it isn't a definitive guide for when you have to.
Wonderful. Thank you for your answer. And I have a comment from Lisa. She's wanted to say thank you so much for this great presentations. They are such interesting and important questions. Seems like this process deserves to continue its momentum and remain an invitation for continued growth and learning. Next question I have is from Dave. So can someone tell us about the significance of tobacco offerings in the initial process? Not everyone knows the significance of the UNDRIP. So would you mind giving an explanation?
For the tobacco protocol, what I was taught growing up is that when you were asking somebody to provide knowledge or to share information with you, it is respectful to offer tobacco. And tobacco is a medicine that we used, I don't want to say historically, but it was a medicine that we used when you would want to show respect. And it was also used at times of war for peacekeeping. So it's not every single culture, Indigenous group in Canada utilizes the tobacco offerings. So when you want to ask somebody to share their knowledge or their information with you, it's respectful to offer tobacco, and how that tobacco is presented and asked there's like more steps to that. But just because somebody accepts tobacco also does not mean that they're agreeing to do what was requested of them. So it's not, that transaction isn't an agreement. It's just an act of showing respect. And we utilize that one within this process because we were asking Elder Norman to provide guidance and grounding and his knowledge to the whole process. And then so we would do tobacco offering. Danilo would have the tobacco and he would pass it over to Norman, and Norman would receive it. I thought it was beautiful in a virtual setting. And I thought it was really great that we were actually able to show that exchange in a virtual setting as well. So yeah, I've also been taught, like, not using tobacco, but you would actually offer a gift of something that you made or were a part of processing. So other times I would offer Stoan, which is dried salmon, as my offering to ask somebody to share the knowledge with me. So it's different regionally, but yeah, that's the one that we chose. Danilo, did you have any?
Sure, I can touch on UNDRIP for those uninitiated. UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it's an international document that countries can adopt, implement, but it's not a and what's challenging is nations in the context of Canada. So if you're talking about, I live a Musqueam territory, Musqueam Nation. However, Musqueam's not represented at the United Nations. So there are these certain challenges of these kind of international documents. It took a long time for Canada to adopt and is now started to implement. I think it was 2007, it was released by the United Nations, and it was 2010 or 2011 when Canada adopted it with conditions because it didn't meet current laws. And it wasn't until 2016 that it was adopted without condition. And in 2021, when asserted it and reinforced it. However, it's going to take maybe decades for this to be reflected in legislation. I brought up British Columbia law, the Heritage Conservation Act, simply because it's being reviewed and with not just a view to UNDRIP, but just modernizing it. And British Columbia adopted UNDRIP before we did nationally. So I guess we have a little bit of a head start. I'm not sure if that's enough of a background on UNDRIP, but it is something that's going to impact all sorts of different industries in different ways. And in many ways, we don't even have a lot of international examples to look towards. So I think Canada is going to be a leader in this.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for your answer. I have another question right here for you all. So objective of guidelines is to increase Indigenous representation in engineering. How will you measure the success?
So I can kick this one off. I feel like you've done all the heavy lifting, Danilo and Gayle, so far. So first of all, the purpose of this guideline is it's somewhat indirect when it comes to increasing Indigenous representation in engineering. So one of its main objectives is really just to build a foundation of trust, or I shouldn't say build a foundation of trust. It's, that's very ambitious, and that's maybe a long-term goal, but certain to begin, establishing ways to build trusting relationships with Indigenous communities. Because if there are, just a sort of series of failures to listen and failures to properly engage, then that's much less likely to be, an appealing or a trusted kind of institution, going into engineering. So I think that's, the theory of developing a guideline like this. In terms of things, we'll look for representation. So in the very short term, we'll be looking at, first of all, like engagement. We do all the usual kind of social media metrics. We want to see like how many people are downloading, how many people are looking at this and actually just wanting to get eyes on it. I think a critical indicator for us is regulator uptake on it. So in several cases in the past, Engineers Canada and the Qualifications Board have developed guidelines that were then picked up and developed further or introduced into actual regulations. So just to be clear, Engineers Canada doesn't establish standards, and we have no sort of authority to mandate that engineers do this or that. We provide supports at a national level and try to create consensus collaboration at a national level. So it's really regulator uptake will be a critical metric there. In terms of looking at Indigenous representation long term, the data is patchy in terms of the number of Indigenous engineers, and of course there are say operators and a variety of people, maybe people who have engineering degrees who don't have PEngs and things like that. So Engineers Canada does collect data on the kind of makeup of the composition. It's all voluntary, and that's where this number of under 1% comes from. And I know that our equity, diversity, inclusion team is looking at ways to gather more concrete data long term. So there'll be, I think reiterating probably surveys and things like that, over the long term, just to get hard numbers that we can take action on. So. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for your answer. And to go back to the 6 previous question in your last slide, how do you keep a living document alive when it's embedded in a static or very slow changing institutions?
Well, I know that I'm going to keep talking with Gayle and Danilo as much as they'll continue to talk to me, but but I mean, I think that through for example, conferences like this and various outreach efforts. We've got a very incredibly talented outreach team in Engineers Canada, and so they look to take up something like a document and iterate it in various ways and generate conversation about it. I think an ideal, just we're sort of resource constrained on how often we can kind of truly fully like revisit and rewrite a guideline. So there's that consideration, but I think that really thinking of the conversations that we have around this kind of iteration of this work, gathering those perspectives, making sure that we maintain those relationships and building them into the next guideline. So I would say, if we had X number of people, or we had say over 100 pieces of feedback on this guideline, which then do those numbers go up over time? That's one way to measure it, but also I think that I think that the way to keep it alive is to really be just maintaining those relationships and really gathering those perspectives on an ongoing basis and looking for the key moments where it's possible to iterate it and expand the scope of what we've done. So yeah, I don't know, thoughts. I don't know.
I think it would also be really important to revisit the process every now and then, not like yearly or anything like that, but as the document evolves, revisit the process of how the document or the guideline came to be, and incorporating more of the Indigenous lens to that process as well.
Do you have any comments, Danilo? Or
yeah, with regards to the connection between the guideline and increasing representation in engineering, it is a little fuzzy, but I honestly believe that I do a lot of work at UBC as well, at the University of Columbia, and looking at strategies to attract more Indigenous people to engineering and how we retain them. And what I've learned there is that there is a disconnect between the value of the engineering profession and young people as they're looking at different.
I think you're a little bit cut out there. Would you mind repeat what you're saying? I'm sorry.
There's the connection that Indigenous youth see to engineering will be bolstered and increased if principles within the guideline are seen in their communities. So this may not have that immediate measurable effect initially, but if these principles are enacted so that protocols become a more normalized thing, where their culture is recognized in the way that projects are, that the engagements and actually the delivery of them, then it will attract people who otherwise looked at the Western education system as something being so foreign and scary and just totally different, as being something that they'll see themselves reflected in more. So like, that's my personal feeling, that there is a connection. It's not as linear as some people might like, and it's certainly going to be hard to measure. But that's my feeling, having met so many Indigenous engineers coming from different types of communities, from the rural kind of Western middle class rural communities to the more remote communities. So that's one thing that I've learned, and it's so anecdotal that it is, like I said, a personal feeling. But that's my contribution to that.
Yeah, you couldn't say it better. Just like what Lisa said in the comment right here. Thank you so much, Danilo. Peru also posted another question as well, and I hope you folks can help me answer it. So duty to consult may vary depending on the type of decisions. New projects are required a thorough review of environmental impacts through environmental license process and or the S35 consultations, while that may not be the case for legacy project built prior to the consultation requirement for 35 consultation and EA license. That's a long sentence. Does your guidelines speak about any such matters on legacy projects?
It does not. I would say that again, through the process of the gatherings, Peru, I appreciate you. It looks like you have a kind of extensive knowledge of this area, but through the gathering process, we realized that the engagement piece is what is heavily kind of lacking, and when we're thinking about improving access to engineering, and then that had to become the kind of front and center of this project. And that was even the non-Indigenous participants who were part of this project, they ended up recognizing just that focus hadn't been articulated, and it required a kind of perspective shift as we were going along. So I think that part of the understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Gayle, but is also that there are considerable resources that already exist, and legal resources that already exist around meeting the duty to consult. And so we had identified a gap, and not just we as a project team, but also like the many participants in the project, had identified that as the gap that needed to be addressed here. So thanks for your question.
Either of you want to add in, Gayle or Danilo?
Gayle, if you'd like to speak to that question, I was going to take one step back to a previous question if you didn't want to speak to. Okay. C, you mentioned those questions that we're left with about engaging with stakeholders on the next iteration and how you build relationships. And I think this guideline and this iteration of it, an initial attempt, essentially, we are creating like a path that wasn't there before, certainly from the Engineers Canada perspective. And one of my reflections on trying to get people into our regional gatherings was like there was a lot of trust that needs to be developed, honestly. And so I remember inviting some people that I knew, or people who I had met who I knew were perfect, and I wanted to hear like what they had to say about this. And in some cases I couldn't get them to attend, with multiple options and stuff. And thinking about it, honestly, I think people want to see what this looks like. And the next time we look to gain feedback from what it looks like, how it's being used, places that it could be better, or audiences that aren't using it. As we find this information out, if we've done our work well and we're sincere and we're listening to feedback, then the next iteration is going to have people who maybe opted out from participating in engagement sessions at the early stages because they quite honestly maybe didn't think it was worth their time. So as we roll this out and we learn from it, and as we see how it performs, essentially, I think it'll be easier to bring more people into the spaces. And there's one thing that we decided early is that this guideline, while in the RFP, it was labeled as for engineers and engineering firms. We recognized early that this has definitely could face both ways as a tool for communities, not necessarily to hold people account, because it's not the type of guide that you can slap someone's wrist because they didn't follow, but because there's principles that are outlined or are outlined in it. So communities can essentially say, like, why are you coming to us now? We don't have the time to respond to your request to do this. Like, this is a guideline that clearly states the benefits of timely initiation of like communications. So we see that some communities, while they have their own engagement policies for external people, some communities have that already. So this guideline won't be of so much use to them. But for communities who don't have the capacity to develop their own, this may be something that they can just essentially, when people reach out to them, they can attach it as a PDF to them. Say, like, going forward, please review this. These are some sections of this guideline we would like you to follow, right? So we recognize that this had value both ways. And then also, since the guidelines the draft has been in draft form. I've also heard from a lot of people from academia who are interested in like, how can I include this in my course? So these EITs that come out of university will hopefully be much more, and based on my experience as an engineering student in the last few years, there is conversations in a lot of classes that are including Indigenous perspectives, the politics behind it, the decision making, the project delivery. So this is an example of how this guideline can be in the hands of people before they're actually leaving school. So this could be something that has that benefit too.
Yes, of course. Sounds like we're looking forward for the next generations to continue to develop this. And I think that's all the questions we have for you all today. Thank you once again for Ryan, Gayle, and Danilo for joining us today. Anything else you'd like to add to this before we wrap up this session?
I just want, I'd like to publicly express my gratitude to all the work that Gayle and Danilo did on this, and also to really express my appreciation on behalf of Engineers Canada that folks were willing to come out and listen and learn more about this. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any further questions now or in the future. I'm always happy to direct your email to somebody else now to try to get you an answer. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thanks for having us. It was enjoyable to present for you guys, and thanks for your thoughtful questions. Yeah, you can reach out to me and Danilo anytime as well. Sorry, my computer's getting glitchy.
I just want to say the same thing. Thank you to Engineers Geoscience and the organizers of Ingenium. I'm going to screw this up. Ingenium?
Yes, that's right. Ingenium. Yeah, you got it.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you all, our audience, for attending this presentation.
Thank you for watching. Visit the Ingenium On Demand library for more exclusive content.